Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Waterparks FANDOM. I first got into Waterparks a few months after the release of their debut record back in 2016. I thought the record overall was a pretty solid pop punk and pop rock listening experience. Wasn't necessarily one of my favorite records of that year or anything, but still a pretty enjoyable project in my opinion, and I definitely appreciated the fact that the band certainly had a personality that was unique to themselves on that album. With the release of their follow-up project Entertainment in 2018, I thought that project was also pretty decent too. However, I did kind of dislike the fact that much of the record did kind of feel like more of the same from the band, but I still did enjoy that project overall, as you could see in my review that I put up when it dropped. So coming into this new record here, I kind of hoped that the band was going to switch things up a bit more. The band's previous two releases showcased that they had a pretty solid foundation for their core sound, and I would like to see the band experiment a bit more on their future releases, which is what I was hoping to see here on FANDOM. And with some of the lead singles to this thing, my thoughts were kind of mixed overall. The lead single for this project, Turbulent, wasn't a track that I particularly cared for. However, the next two tracks that we got from this thing I thought were a bit more interesting overall from a lyrical perspective and just instrumentally as well. So overall, I just really was not 100% sure what to expect from FANDOM coming into this thing. And after giving this thing a good few listens now at this point, this is a record that is kind of frustrating to me personally, I guess. I know I've said that a lot in the past few weeks when reviewing records, but I guess there's just been a lot of records I've found frustrating recently because, at least for this record here, on the one hand, the band certainly does switch things up here on FANDOM compared to the last two releases, but at the same time there's a lot of aspects to this record that I don't particularly care for, or I think could have been executed maybe a bit better. It's a pretty, average record overall, I would say. It's not terrible or anything, but at the same time I don't think it's particularly great either. It's just a lot of unused potential here in this record, at least for me personally. I'll start by talking about the lyrics here on this project, as I think this is probably the aspect of the record that I think had the most potential to be super interesting, but it kind of ends up falling flat instead. On this record, you mainly had two different lyrical themes being discussed. The first of those being an analysis and reflection on the topic of a fandom and the band themselves, and how these two different parties interact. The second topic being a breakup. And these two topics, if you couldn't already tell, don't really seem like they have all too much overlap when it comes to the lyrics because they're vastly different topics. And unfortunately, I think this is what causes the album to be kind of jarring at times from a lyrical standpoint, as the album at one moment will be talking about one topic before switching off into something completely different. I do think that the lyrics on this thing talking about the band themselves and the fandom and all of that stuff happens to be the more interesting set of lyrics on this thing, especially on tracks like Watch What Happens Next, one of these singles released beforehand. I think that this track's lyrics are probably some of the strongest, if not the strongest, on the entire record, essentially talking about the band themselves and how they have to, release music to make money and just live a normal life, and how they strive to be successful, but how in the world of rock music that oftentimes is seen as a negative thing. Rock artists are, supposed to be making it just for the music itself. They're not supposed to want to make money or be successful or things like that, but this is often a mindset that could be really detrimental to the bands themselves in the scene. And I like the fact that the band was talking about this pretty openly here on this track, as while I do think it is important to maintain artistic integrity in your music, at the same time it can't be denied that it is a major goal of all artists out there to be making money off of their music so that they could, continue to make more money and music in the future and just live a normal life off of this money and music, things like that. Yeah, overall, I just really like the fact that the band was talking about this here on this track. The track Dreamboy also has some pretty interesting lyrics talking about how oftentimes fans can kind of portray particular artists and musicians as being this kind of ideal figure, when in reality that's oftentimes not the case, and how this could often end up hurting the fans themselves who view this artist in a particular skewed manner, or the artist even themselves, because they have expectations to behave and act a certain way when in reality they've never really showcased those traits before. Overall, I find the discussion about fandoms and the artists themselves involved on this project to be pretty interesting, and I wish the band had really focused on this set of lyrics for the entire record to some extent, because I feel like the other subject of the lyrics here, the breakup aspect of this project, is not quite as interesting. That's not to say the lyrics are necessarily terrible here on this part of the record or anything, but I oftentimes feel like some of the song topics for these tracks focused on the breakup are a lot more typical and just a lot less interesting and unique compared to some of the songs analyzing the whole fandom aspect of this project. It just feels like on this record that there's two big lyrical topics here that don't have much in common, that are oftentimes clashing here on this record. I guess you could say to some extent that, you know, these do share some qualities with each other. Like, for example, to go back to Dreamboy, you could say that the expectations that fans have of particular artists could mirror, say, the expectations that somebody has for a significant other in a relationship or something like that. However, this kind of connection is never really brought up all that often here on the project, and whenever something like it kind of is, it's always done so in a sort of vague way, to the point where I'm not even sure that's the intent of the lyrics, or if I'm maybe just trying to tie together these two concepts because I want this record to be more cohesive than it actually is. So that covers all my thoughts on the lyrics and themes of this record, really. When it comes to the instrumentals and the sound of this project, I was happy to see that the band was switching things up here compared to the last two releases. This record is a lot poppier and a lot more electronic influence than any of the two records that the band had dropped previously. Now, of course, the band has, on previous records, played around with different electronic elements. They've always been a pretty poppy group as well. However, this record, more so than ever, is dipping into those sounds and genre elements to make a project that sounds definitely a lot more different and unique compared to how, say, Entertainment sounded in comparison to the debut record from these guys. However, while I do enjoy the fact that the band was trying out some different ideas here on Fandom from a sonic perspective, I don't really care personally for a lot of these sounds that the band brings on board here on this thing, unfortunately. I think the electronic sounds that the band brings here to this project just aren't the most interesting or anything along those lines. Like, they're fine enough to listen to, they're not painful to listen to or anything, but at the same time, they're not super exciting, they don't really grab my attention all too often, and they're just kind of there for the most part. Oftentimes, it's some of the songs on this record where the band dips into sounds that they are maybe a bit more familiar with, maybe some of the more pop-punk focused sounds on this thing that I think that the band is at their most comfortable and best sounding on this project. For example, tracks like Watch What Happens Next or Easy to Hate, even parts of the closing song on this album too. I think that these tracks overall may be a bit stronger on the record just because the electronic elements are kind of downplayed here to some extent, and some of the more guitar-driven aspects of these songs just a bit more interesting. I just feel overall like a lot of the instrumentals on this thing, with how clean and overproduced they sound, that it doesn't really fit very nicely with the very aggressive, bitter lyrics that often fill this record, especially on some of the breakup tracks. Probably one of the biggest examples on this thing being the song Turbulent, which features some of the most angry lyrics on this entire project, that I think would have been a very nice fit for a more natural, aggressive sounding instrumental, but instead you get this really sleek, overproduced electronic instrumental that I just don't think pairs up really nicely with a lot of the emotion that's trying to be conveyed here on this track. Occasionally some of these more clean sounding instrumentals will work pretty nicely, for example on a track like Dreamboy, which I think plays pretty nicely into this kind of boy band-esque sound that I think the band pulls off really nicely. But for the most part on this record, I feel like the more electronic driven instrumentals just don't really fit very nicely, maybe with the lyrical themes, either that or they just sound kind of bland and uninteresting. There are also some cuts on this record that sonically manage to be a bit different from some of the other sounds that I mentioned previously. For example, the track War Crimes, certain parts of this track feel pretty reminiscent of the more guitar-driven pop-punk sound that this band was initially known for, but at the same time you have like this weird electronic breakdown that comes later on in the track that feels like straight out of 2011 or something. in a weird way. Like, it's just so weird and out of place. At the same time, it takes up so little of the track's overall runtime that I almost feel, looking back on it, like it didn't actually happen. But yes, it does in fact happen. I can guarantee that, and it just feels kind of awkward overall, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The track Never Bloom Again is a song that is pretty much this album's kind of acoustic, stripped back pop rock song. You know, lots of pop punk and pop rock albums tend to have at least one cut like this, and oftentimes they're among my least favorites. However, I will say this track here is probably one of the stronger cuts on this record. I think lyrically it's pretty solid. The vocal performance here on this track is also one of the best on the entire record. The instrumental here is kind of bland, kind of forgettable, but still, I do think this is one of the more standout moments on the record for what it's worth. So overall, Fandom is a record that, like I said at the start of this review, is kind of frustrating for me because on the one hand, the band is doing things on this record that I wanted them to do coming into this thing. And at the same time, they bring to the table some interesting ideas here, especially when it comes to the lyrics here and talking about fandoms and the band themselves and things like that. I think those lyrical themes are pretty unique, pretty interesting, and the band does a pretty good job talking about them here on this record. However, I just feel like there's a lot of missed opportunities here on this project as well, and unused potential, or instances where the band could have done something more interesting, but instead they did something that just didn't really click with me as much. Again, like I also said before, this isn't a terrible album or even necessarily a bad album by any means. I just feel like it ends up being pretty mediocre, all things considered, because there are some good moments on this project, good individual tracks, good individual ideas spread out across this thing. There's just also a good amount of moments here that I didn't really find myself enjoying, or that I just found to be kind of boring and uninteresting. But overall, that is just my own personal opinion here on this record. Didn't quite enjoy this one as much as the band's previous two releases, but maybe you will enjoy it more. In fact, if you happen to have a different opinion on this project, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.